Welcome back to the Deeper Dive podcast, produced in the Catholic Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. My name is Bill Winnell, joined today by Father Larry Swink. Good afternoon, Father.
Hey, good afternoon.
And Monsignor Charles Pope. Monsignor, how are you?
Fine, doing well.
Today is part 5 of Veritatis Splendor, and Father will get us started today on the section on martyrdom. Father.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. And so we're kind of getting through this document. We got a few more sections. I'm not sure if we'll finish it today, but we're getting closer to the end. We're at number 90, if you're looking at the document. And what we're going to talk about today is martyrdom, and it's the exaltation of the inviolable holiness of God's law. And I was very touched by this section, and never really thought of it this way. That well, obviously I've known this, but that these people died for the truth of our faith, the precepts, and sometimes for moral reasons, rather than do something immoral. They died for it. And actually, I would say most martyrs, that's why they died. Actually, all of them. But so I'll start with number 90, and I'll hand it over a little to Monsignor. But it says the relationship between faith and morality shines forth with all its brilliance in the unconditional respect due to the insistent demands of the personal dignity of every man, demands protected by those moral norms which prohibit, without exception, actions which are intrinsically evil. The universality of the immutability of the moral norm make manifest at the same time to serve to protect the personal inviolability of man. And then it goes on to say that basically that martyrs are the ones that stand up for this truth. So, hey, Monsignor, why don't we jump into the Latin word of martyr and why it's important, and then we're going to go into Susanna. Susanna and John the Baptist are the two examples that he uses.
Interesting, yeah. Well, martyr is actually a Greek word and means witness, martyros, martyron meaning witness or giving witness, and so it first means that. And later, it tends in English to exclusively refer to people who give their life, shed their blood, if you will, for the Lord. But originally, it just meant witness. Now, again, being a witness is often not an easy thing. A witness life is not a happy one. I mean, from a worldly point of view. So again, the connection between blood martyrdom and witness is important. Also, we know we have other types of martyrdom. Those who suffer great loss, a kind of, but not their life, sometimes called a white martyrdom. And there's also the confessors of the faith that usually suffered imprisonment and sometimes disfigurement. They would be, have their eye put out, or different tortures and things like that. So again, those would be some of the ways that we can talk about the word martyr, again, which is a word that basically most fundamentally means witness.
Yeah, thank you. I like that point you were saying about confessors. Because in the litany of Loretto, it says Queen of Confessors. And I always thought that just meant people that hear confessions, like priests. You just told me these are people that suffered for the faith, correct?
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Yeah, to confess really means to declare, as you know, and we link it to the sacrament of confession, which means an audible or declaration of one's sins. But the point of the word is to be one who declares their faith. And in this case, it gets looped into the sacrament of confession because we declare our sins.
Yeah, interesting. Very well. I learned something on my own podcast. That's awesome. And and now we go into this Old Testament example that he holds up, and there are quite a few. I like the one from Maccabees personally, but he uses Susanna. And I thought this was interesting. I'll read the paragraph and we can dive into this a little bit. He says, in the Old Testament, we already find admirable witnesses of fidelity to the holy law of God, even to the point of a voluntary acceptance of death. A prime example is the story of Susanna in reply to the two unjust judges who threatened to have her condemned to death if she refused to yield to their sinful passion, she says, quote, I am hemmed in on every side, for if I do this thing, it is death for me. But if I do not, I shall not escape your hands. I choose not to do it and to fall into your hands rather than to sin in the sight of the Lord. Daniel 13:22 to 23. And it goes on to say, Suzanne, preferring to fall innocent into the hands of the judges, bears witness not only to her faith and trust in God, but also to her obedience to the truth and to the absoluteness of the moral order, unquote.
Yeah.
Wow. So a little commentary on that, Monsignor. Well, we know these two men had bad intentions, and but
Right.
a pretty powerful story. I know in the Mass, it's always like the longest reading of the whole
And
entire year.
yeah, it's a long, long reading. It comes somewhere toward the end of Lent, I recall.
Right.
Yeah, boy. And what daily mass? My gosh.
Yeah, that's right. 7 o'clock at 6:30 Mass,
Yeah,
like we're reading
man.
Susanna.
Well, anyway, and also, as you probably know, it's in the books that the Protestants don't have.
Right.
And that's sad for them. It's a magnificent story, but again, I think what she dies she's rescued by Daniel. It says a part of the book of Daniel, and she's rescued by Daniel, who basically calls these men out for their lie. And he does it's a kind of a brilliant study for trial attorneys. you know and he separated them and had them give separate testimony, and one, their testimony differed, and so he says, you fiends, and they were put to death in the way that they wanted her to be put to death. But again, so the basic story is, just for our listeners who are less familiar, Susanna goes into a garden where she bathes. It's a closed garden. It has walls, but these men seem to know her schedule a bit, and they decide to hide in the garden so that when she goes to bathe, they came up and basically tried to have their way with her, and she slipped away, and they were angry and went out and told the townsfolk that they happened to come in the garden and find her with a young man.
Mm.
And they of course sullied her reputation, and she was scheduled to be put to death for this terrible crime. And again, it takes Daniel to come to the rescue, and he again shows how their testimony doesn't add up. It's contradictory, and proves her innocent, and then they are taken out. These old men who tried to do this, and they are killed. Put to death for this crime of lying. Now, bearing false witness is also a very interesting study in sin. It says, like, as I recall, number one, the first thing they did was they suppressed. It said, the text says they
Yeah.
suppressed their consciences.
I remember
And
that.
then
Yeah.
it goes on to say they would not allow their eyes to look to heaven. They tried to be forgetful of God, and they did not keep in mind just judgments that would come to them. So these three ingredients bring them to this terrible crime. They're forgetful, of these things. God sees all things, and we will answer to God one day for what we do. But anyway, I think the Pope, in bringing her up, is seeing that she's a martyr for the truth, and
Hmm.
in the sense that she was a willing martyr for the truth, and people will suffer.
Right.
They will often suffer. People tell lies, and we sometimes suffer,
Right.
but we have to live the truth, and she
Yeah.
did.
But it's almost like the real life depiction of that. Well, not that was a real life depiction, obviously, but a modern day depiction would be the Maria Goretti story.
Yeah.
Where she was affronted by Alessandro, and said no, it's a sin, and then she was stabbed 17 times by this man, and actually did die, rather than yield to a violation of, or his violation of, it wouldn't have been her violation because she was divorced, but rather than yield to sins against chastity. And it's just it's just amazing the strength of these
Mhm.
women,
Yeah.
and but once again, the point is that this is like, it's amazing how God, there are such examples in the Bible, but also in our
Mhm.
saints, our martyrology, where
Mhm.
there are people that rather than sin gave their life.
Yeah.
And
Exactly right.
the next one is John the Baptist. I always like John the Baptist.
Yeah,
He probably wasn't a lot of fun to hang out with, but he was one heck of a preacher.
that's
Um,
right.
you know, I mean, talk about a man who was ascetical. He was probably lived Lent his whole life. And here it says in the document, Monsignor, it says at the dawn of the New Testament, John the Baptist, unable to refrain from speaking of the law of the Lord and rejecting any compromise with evil, quote, gave his life in witness to truth and justice, unquote, and thus also became the forerunner of the Messiah in the way he died. The
Yeah.
one who came to bear witness to light and deserved to be called by that same light, which is Christ, a
Mhm.
burning and shining lamp, was cast in the darkness of prison. The one to whom it is granted to baptize the Redeemer of the world was thus baptized in his own blood, unquote. Uh,
Mhm.
love that. So yeah, I mean, we know why he died. He told Herod that he was guilty of adultery, and Herodias,
He was living with Philip's wife. Yeah.
Philip's wife, decided, well, let's get rid of this guy. let's
That's right.
let's cancel him for
And actually,
good.
it wasn't even Herod who kind of liked to listen to John and
Yeah,
somehow had his conscience touched, but the Herodias, the wife of Herod, she would have none of it, and she connived to have him put to death.
yeah,
Bring his head to me on a platter. A terrible thing, So like we see with Susanna, who instead of she could have gotten maybe saved her life by committing sin with these men, but she said no. I would rather fall innocent. And so she entrusted herself to these judges, and she wouldn't sin, and she was actually sentenced to death. Although thanks be to God, she escaped. But now John the Baptist did not escape. But it's interesting, and I have this sad. I mean, it's very sad to me, Father, when I think of John the Baptist, or I think of John Fisher, St. John Fisher, or I think of St. Thomas More, who stood up for the sanctity of marriage. And there's so many today who just can't be bothered with that. Oh, come on, wave them through the communion. And, we hand out annulments like candy. And it's just, gosh, there are men who died for the truth of
right.
marriage. And
And the
it's just
Christian
sad.
churches all over, they're just flying the flag, and
Yeah.
and yeah, exactly. We're not encouraging people to stay faithful, and
No.
yeah, the whole divorce remarriage thing,
Oh,
which it's
jeez.
like let's dodge around this.
And that so-called footnote and the Amoris Laetitia,
TCA,
all the, and apparently poor John the Baptist, if only he'd gotten the memo from us that it's not that big a deal, John,
right,
or
right.
if only Thomas More, you don't have to die, man, come on, just, send it through the other tribunal. If you didn't work, I mean, just, it's very sad. I think we have a lot of soul searching to do as a church today about that. And, and as I say, I'm going to be careful because there is such a thing as an annulment. And I think Jesus himself makes way for it when he says,
Right.
what God has joined together, let no one divide. But, you know, so, in other words, not every marriage that happens, is what, quote, God joined together. But you've got you've got a kind of a situation where we give out so many annulments today. This I can't process it all. So I'm not here to. If anyone's listening and you got an annulment, I'm not saying your annulment was terrible. I don't know anything about your case, but I'm just saying that the number we give out is kind of shocking.
Well, John Paul II apparently would go to the Roman Rota, and every year he would tell them, especially the Americans,
Mhm.
like you have to defend the dignity of or the indissolubility of marriage, and make sure
Mhm.
that this is a just trial. And I think, I don't know. I mean, the
Well,
joke
again,
with a lot of canon lawyers is that to get an annulment is about as easy as getting a driver's license sometimes
you're
today.
getting a ham sandwich,
Right. And I think,
even
and
easier.
and I wonder if it I mean, there's two ways of looking at this. In our culture, the way that we've treated marriage since the 1950s and 60s,
Mhm.
and sexuality, I mean, maybe
Mhm.
there's a case to be said that a lot of marriages were just built not on solid rock, maybe,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know. I don't know. I don't know if you've done many. I've done many annulments in my
Mhm.
priesthood.
Oh yeah.
There was one in particular, but I once had a woman call me and said she wanted an annulment, and she wasn't even divorced yet.
Yeah. Right. Right.
I said, how about marriage counseling? He's like, no, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm going to get divorced. But, well, you're not divorced yet. It's like, it was just bizarre,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. Right.
It turned,
Well,
anyway.
all I can say with all these things is, even the Pope John Paul, God bless him, but he didn't choose to really do anything. He just kind of railed against it and said, this is terrible. And I think, I know even popes can't solve every problem in the church, but he could have, I think, probably done more to rein in this. The main offender in the annulment question is the so-called grave lack of due discretion, which you used to just call it immaturity. And there's so
Right.
many of them. There's such a vague norm, and they're mostly filed under those. And I mean, there can be obvious good grounds for an annulment, but too many of them are just decided on. They were immature at the time. Well, I mean, who of us haven't learned? I'm more. I was immature last year compared to this year.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Only,
I
only
well,
I knew then what I know now.
well, I mean, could we have said that about our priesthood when we were going to the
Yeah,
seminary?
right. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know if I was the most mature person. I don't know at
yeah. Did I
49 I'm the
really
most
know what
mature
it meant
person.
to be a priest on the day of my ordination?
Probably not. Yeah. Right.
So I mean, again, all these are it's troubling, and I this is no time in the church to have a council about anything, frankly.
Well, I
I
think the
would
other
wish
side
we
of
could
this,
just bring people together and say, we've got to fix this, make this
well,
thing
I
more
think the bigger
intelligent.
problem here, Monsignor, too, is this,
Yeah.
is like how many John the Baptists do we have in the pulpit today
No.
that are willing to speak about these issues in
No, yeah.
a clear manner,
Yeah.
in terms of like, okay, today we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. And it's almost like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
sometimes you preach something and you tie in something that is
Hmm.
quote unquote, I hate the word controversial, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, why is it? It's not controversial in the church. It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be, but
It shouldn't
headquarters
be in the
doesn't have our
church
back if
building.
we do talk about it, though. I'm going to tell you, that, Father.
Oh yeah. Oh, I've known it way too well. And it's like, but I think is there a willingness to suffer a little bit of
Yeah.
getting, walk by at the end of mass in order
Mhm.
to speak
Sure.
the truth to people, to help them to save
Yeah.
their souls.
Well, there
And
are certainly opportunities we have to preach on it, and I try to. But as I say, it's always a rearguard action. So many of them have already been divorced and remarried and divorced again.
oh, I know.
It's
Yeah.
just, it's like, wow. Anyway, well, again, we could lament this forever, but I will say that maybe to put a bow on the whole thing in terms of suffering, I also wish that a lot of married couples would begin to rethink that marriage isn't just about being happy all the time, and that there is a martyrdom that sometimes we have to have in marriage where couples
Right.
sometimes have to endure things about their spouse that they wish were different. And I think that at some level, the idea that if there's any suffering in marriage they want out is a problem too. And when parents throw down the cross, we're not happy anymore, then the kids have to end up picking it up, carrying it. So
Yeah.
I think somewhere in all of this, we've completely lost this idea of martyrdom and witnessing for the truth. I'm also mindful of something that the Pope doesn't mention, but you remember that moment in the trial with Pilate
Yeah.
where Jesus said, "You say that I'm a king, but here's the reason I was born, and this is why I came into the world, to testify to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me." So Jesus himself was a martyr for the truth, and all of us are kind of playing it safe, if we're not
Yeah.
careful, and we're staying
Yeah.
quiet and keeping our head down.
Well, I hear that a lot. People say you gotta be careful, Father. You gotta be careful. Careful of what? Careful. But there's a great line in here, Monsignor, that I read it like several times. Hold on. Let
Mhm.
me see if I um hold on. Let me see if I can find number 93, second paragraph.
Mhm.
Um, well, it goes through different examples of martyrs, like Saint Ignatius of Antioch, which he's incredible. But here it is. It's a quote oh, here it is. It's number 94. And I love
Oh,
this quote. It says, the words of the Latin poet Juvenal apply to all. Quote, consider it the greatest of crimes to prefer survival to honor, and out of love of physical life to lose the very reason for living,
mm.
unquote.
Amen.
And I was like, man, that's a Roman poet who
Right.
wrote that, you know,
Right.
not a Catholic martyr. That was a Roman poet, you know?
Yeah.
But like the idea of like how many times, I mean, how many of us at
Yeah.
times are so tempted to or have compromised for human life
Mhm.
or given up like or maybe for honor or lack of, you know, losing our honor,
Mhm.
you know, or to get honor. You know, it was like we're going back to the
Mhm.
Thomas More.
Yeah.
There's that great that scene from Thomas More where that one secretary and he tells him to be a school teacher.
Oh,
And
yeah.
do you remember the famous quote, Thomas More? He's like, for he won some
Oh,
chancery assignment
well,
and
for Wales.
but for Wales, yeah. Do you remember how that goes?
Yeah,
I,
well, basically, he says, I would have thought if you had brought in a great reward for ratting me out, I'm
yeah,
summarizing it.
right.
He says, I could almost understand. Oh, but for Wales?
Right.
Yeah. By the way, there's you've probably heard before and he was, I'm sure, quoting someone else, but Dr. Martin Luther King would often say something it was a similar idea that if you haven't found something worth dying for, you're not fit to live.
Yeah.
And or by the way, another quote that the Pope has there at the end of 93, Gregory the Great teaches, and this gets
Hmm.
back to what I was saying about that we have to learn how to endure trials in life a little bit better. But he says, Gregory the Great teaches one can actually, quote, love the difficulties of this world for the sake of eternal rewards.
Yes.
So when
Yes.
trouble comes up in a marriage or what have you, there can be that witness or martyrdom, if you will, of enduring. My husband or whatever wife is a drinker, and they don't seem to be able to stop, and all the things you could imagine. But somewhere I'm going to stick by them and try my best to help and keep this thing together. And there's a martyrdom there, a kind of a martyrdom.
Yeah,
And
Yeah. That's it. That's a great quote. Monsignor, let me read this slowly because
Mhm.
this is so awesome. He says, I remember reading this too. And I was like, wow, that is so good. It says, the Christian is called with the grace of God, invoked in prayer to a sometimes heroic commitment. And this, he or she, is sustained by the virtue of fortitude, whereby, as Gregory the Great teaches, one can actually, quote, love the difficulties of this world for the sake of eternal rewards.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's like, well, there we have it. It goes back to our Lord's saying, right?
Hmm.
What do you get? What do you gain to gain the whole world, yet to forfeit your eternal soul?
Yeah. Yeah.
For whales.
For whales. And by the way, in case our listeners don't know, Wales is not the thing that swims in the ocean. It's Wales is a part of England, perhaps an inferior territory to Londonderry.
Right, right. No.
Yes.
Have you ever found yourself sort of up against the ropes where you felt tempted to compromise or you felt
Mhm.
like the Holy Spirit just came through and you just like put your foot down? Or
Yeah.
do you think we're all going to be in that type of situation?
Well, it's awfully it can get scary for a minute, can it? I mean, I can say there are some things people I wish I'd spoken to that I didn't because I
Yeah.
was too anxious about it. And I can just say that I'm not without having to examine my own conscience. I'm not known to be guarded
Yeah.
in the way I speak. But on the other hand, sometimes going up against an individual saying, "I want to talk to you,"
Yeah.
and I know you've gotten hit a few times, Father, for this too. But we had to sometimes wonder and think twice. There's a well-known politician who's come to our parish, maybe for a funeral, or maybe they attend regularly. Because I'm right
Right.
up here on Capitol Hill. Do I go to speak to them, and what'll happen if I do? And I
Right.
know I should.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
so the
Yeah.
question is, but I also know headquarters. At least we have a new archbishop now, but headquarters doesn't usually have our back when we confront these politicians and say,
Well,
you
if
need
you
to think
don't
twice.
confront them, you'll be assigned the Bishop of Wales.
That's right. Well,
but if
all I can say is that we have to remember that one day we'll answer to God, and
but
Right.
if but
we
if you
seem to be
do
very more worried about man than God.
if you do confront him, you could be Bishop of Shady Grove Hospital.
That's right. That's right. Hello,
For
hello.
for life. Yeah. No, I know, but this is a great document about testifying the truth. But I think too, listeners, listening to this, like, what about if your kid is getting married outside the church? What if,
Mhm.
whatever, one of your children tells you they have same-sex attractions,
Mhm.
all this other stuff. I mean, there's ways that you can still be faithful to God and still love them.
Yeah,
And
right.
but it's going to come at a little bit of a cost. You're
It
gonna
is.
you're gonna get hit
Mhm.
because it always looks like, you're trying to play holier than thou, which is not the truth.
Mhm.
That's not
Right, right.
what we're saying. It's just truth comes first, and that's what this document is saying,
Mhm.
right? And are you willing to sometimes have that heroic commitment,
Right.
which could lead to a difficulty, right? Um,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, and of course, the other thing too is everybody's always waiting to find the right words or the right moment. And look, who was the greatest preacher, evangelizer that ever was? Who's the one who knew all the right words, but he still got nailed to a tree? Are you better
right,
than Jesus? Are you a better preacher or a teacher? He got rejected all the time. And so I think somewhere, yeah, our fear of rejection and all this, and we think we can't say anything until we have just the right thing. At some point, we could wait forever, and it's going to involve tension. It just is, and
right,
too many are just not willing to endure any tension. And
yeah. So the next section, Monsignor, then we can go into political life a little bit, and it talks a little bit totalitarianism. Sorry, tongue twister.
yeah,
Um, but in the next section, it's basically just he kind of has a little bit of I'd say a commercial break. Basically emphasizing the universal, unchanging moral norms at the service of the person and society, which I think is a prelude to what he's going to get into. But
mhm,
basically, it says.
mhm,
The church in no way is the author or arbiter of this norm. The obedience to the truth, which is Christ, whose
mhm.
image is reflected in the nature and dignity of the human person, the
Yeah.
church interprets the moral norm and proposes it to all people of goodwill without concealing its demands or radicalness and perfection.
Hmm.
And I like that, sometimes the truth is radical and it does sound radical, but it is perfect. And the
Yeah.
church's teachings are perfect when they've been officially interpreted from God and given to us by Jesus Christ himself, which is the
Hmm.
divine deposit.
Now, all of this is related. The title of the section is Morality and the Renewal of Social and Political Life. Well, you see, we often are lamenting the world today. Why is it that people can't even tell the difference between a man and a woman, or to say that a man can be a woman? How did we get into this confusion and foolishness or gay marriage, or physician-assisted suicide, or abortion on demand? I mean, how did all this happen? Well, you don't have to look very far. Just look into places where Christians gather. It's us. It's on us. We got quiet. We got silent. It's
Yeah.
interesting the way Robert Barron puts it. He says, right at the time when we most needed to be equipped to speak out and be out in the world announcing the truth, we were very preoccupied. We just come out of the Vatican Council and we were tuning up guitars and turning around altars and worrying about who could do what. Can a woman do this? And we lost the culture. We were all turned inward, having fights among
Which was
ourselves.
actually supposed to be the opposite.
Yeah, right.
And we went, it was supposed to be going outward and we
Yeah.
didn't. We got more inward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a terrible loss, but it's to say we are supposed to be, Jesus says, the salt of the earth. Now, salt preserves it from corruption. Before refrigeration, salt was used to, preserve meats and other things, and prevent putrefaction, and it could even be used to cauterize wounds and things. And salt has that effect. It helps to preserve. And
Yeah.
likewise, we're supposed to be light so that the world isn't in darkness. And we're supposed to reflect the light of Christ. And we haven't been. And so, is it any wonder why some people think that there's no real difference, or there are 50 genders, or that the difference between men and women isn't for real? And, all of these kinds of things. I mean, we got this confused because, as the Pope says here, the, we forgot our role in proclaiming the moral truth so that there would be a constant renewal of social and political life. And we got quiet, and
Yeah.
evil has triumphed and darkness has conquered.
Right. No, 100%. And yeah, so he goes on here, talking about some of the principles of social moral teaching. And basically he says that there's a connection, as it reaffirms what he's always been saying through this document, between truth and freedom, and
Mhm.
express a essential bond between God's wisdom and will. And it's extremely significant for the life of persons in the socio-economic and socio-political sphere. And then he kind of goes into, some of these terms that we've talked about in the past, like solidarity and also basically he says in economic matters, the respect for the human dignity requires practice of virtue of temperance, right? Preferential treatment of the poor, all these things and the things that go against that. But he goes into the last part, he talks about totalitarianism. And Monsignor, could you kind of, as the church looks at, or maybe in a
Mhm.
political way, what does it
Mhm.
mean when a government is totalitarian?
Yeah, well, it generally means it's oppressive, but the word totalitarianism is interesting, that the total or the collective is more important than the individual. Um,
Right,
and that the individual really matters nothing except that they are somehow in service of the total or the group. And so this is totalitarianism. It and it's not that there's never a time to say the good of the one or the good of the many. There is such a thing as the common good, but it's an excess of this where individuals are like just cogs. And when a cog wears out, you just throw it away. And instead of saying, no, this is a precious human and individual, and the total, the totalitarian, we need to take care of even wounded or hurt or suffering individuals. But totalitarianism says no, and it generally amounts to a complete denial of the dignity of the human person, every individual human person, and just sees them as, well, how did Stalin put it? The death of one human being is a tragedy. The death of 5 million is a statistic, you
ooh,
know. And so the idea is that, again, the individual, well, there might be 5 million of them, but, the question is all about the total. And so
yeah,
again, that's where the word comes from. Now, but at the end of the day, there comes then this. We tend to use the word totalitarianism today as a sign of an imperious centralized state that persecutes. It's very top down. It's imperious. It's commanding.
right,
It's all about the state rather than the individual. So into the idea of individual rights and so on don't exist. It's all about the state. And
right.
so this is where the word has come to mean that politically. So,
Yeah, yeah. And he says this. This is interesting. He said the root of modern totalitarianism is to be found in denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person, who is the visible image of the invisible God. But he also says this above that: totalitarianism rises out of denial of
true.
truth of the denial of truth in the objective sense. If there is no transcendent truth in obedience to which man achieves its full identity, then there is no principle for guaranteeing just relations between people. That's interesting, right? So the
Hmm.
idea is if there's nothing that we can agree upon as solid,
Hmm.
then it's tyranny.
Tyranny of relativism. Yeah.
Right. And that's exactly what we're even seeing in United States of America today.
Yeah.
I mean, we're so
You betcha.
divided because there's not this belief in biblical truth.
Hmm. And another way of putting it, Father, is the word culture has at its root the word cultus or cult. Now,
Right.
in English, unfortunately, the word cult comes off poorly, but in its original meaning in Latin, cultus just means a shared devotion or a shared religion. And so, what happens then to a country like ours, for example, where we kick God to the curb and we no longer collectively all look to the one God, to the cultus, if you will. There cannot be a culture if there isn't a shared cultus. It becomes an anti culture. It becomes, like you say, the tyranny of relativism, where individuals just squawk and scream, and there's no way for all of us to come together and reason together. Now, the biblical narrative used to supply that in America. We always had sectarian differences, but
Yes.
fundamentally, the cultus that we shared that made for our culture was the biblical narrative, the Old Testament as well as the New. This was a Christian nation. All of our founding documents make references and so on to the to this. And so, with all that in mind, we have a real problem on our hands today. That's what the Pope's getting at here, that this totalitarian arises when you kick God to the curb and there's no longer any shared devotion or understanding or vision that the biblical narrative used to supply us. And by one final maybe note about that, we sort of look askance today at rulers who insisted that their subjects all follow their religion and they would impose religion. And I get that there's trouble with that. But their vision wasn't very far from the truth, in that if these people are all divided religiously, we can't have a nation. We can't have a unity. We've got to somehow have one devotion or faith that unites us. And oh no, man, diversity, pluralism, and we have, there's a place for those things, but there's also a place for unity. And unity, if diversity only really can exist if there's a core of unity.
Right.
No,
100%, 100%. Yeah. So yeah, this is the key, is that, we've got this, and he goes on to say that, both socialism and democratic societies can go awry if there's, like you're saying, this ultimate truth that we all look to as a guide.
Yeah.
If there's no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power.
Yeah.
As history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism.
Yeah. And that's where we're headed right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a powerful quote, and it's
Yeah.
one last thing, Monsignor. What's this concept? I've always grew up hearing this, and I still hear it today, that you're supposed to faith and politics are that we're not faith and politics are divided, or what's the saying?
Don't talk about faith or politics,
right? Or
religion or
don't
politics,
don't bring faith into your politics. Has that ever been
separation of church and state, man?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That is it. They just like the idea that they tie the two together. That separation of church and state is the same as not bringing faith into politics. That's not what the founding fathers meant.
No, of course not.
Right.
The idea of maybe not having a state religion, and as I just said a few minutes ago, that was controversial at the time. There was a basic instinct that rulers had that the people need to have the state religion, so to speak. And I understand there's issues with that, but it does have an insight, namely that somehow we need to have some kind of buy-in, that we all are going to answer one day to something that's above our current cultural situation. And we're going to all answer to him one day, and he's given us some important guidance, and we all need to agree and follow that. And we used to do that when the biblical narrative was at the heart of it. You may remember a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a book called Democracy in America. And he argued in that book that America is a very fragile situation. He says the danger is that they, in their Declaration of Independence, they spoke of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, that's not what the classical philosophers like Socrates and Plato and all said. For them, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of the good. And so he says this change of it came through Locke and Hume and a few others. The pursuit of happiness is troublesome to de Tocqueville. And he said, but this is too subjective. We need, but he says the American people do have this, though, going for them. Namely, that they seem to have they're very religious people, and the biblical narrative lives loudly in them. But take that away, and this whole thing is doomed to fail.
And it becomes just about happiness.
Yeah, particular.
Not the good.
Yeah, right. And so again, he says that the biblical narrative would supply that what's meant by the happiness, namely the good, but take it away, which we have. And well, you've seen that old meme that's out there. Someone is crying out, there's been another school shooting. Where is God in times like these? And Jesus sort of steps up and says, well, you kicked me out of the schools.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Oh,
No,
has it any wonder?
no, that's a good, well, that's a good place to end, Monsignor. We just finished politics. So yeah, folks, I mean, the bottom line is that Christ has to be a center of all of our activities. I mean, that's what this is about. It has to be
Yeah.
the center of our life, our social life, our recreation, everything.
Jesus said, I am the truth.
Yeah, I mean, it's just life. You know, I am the life, the way, the truth, and the life. He wants to be in your life, all parts of our life, not just some.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Monsignor, can we get a blessing from you, sir?
Yes, Lord. Help us, save us, have mercy on us, Lord, and keep us in your grace. And may Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.